to Ether Hour, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalygin here with another Q&A. We are here answering your questions, the loyal World War Now Ether Hour supporters who are on the Substack supporting us behind that paywall, keeping the show running. All of you listening, this is the free preview, of course. All of you listening on the free section realize that the people asking these questions, these are the ones that keep the free show available for you, as well as, of course, all the Ether Hours, and they get to ask the questions. So if you want to join them behind the paywall, click the link down below or just type into your browser in your phone's internet browser, worldwarnow.co, and you will find the way to support the show. Listen to every episode of Ether Hour. We release one episode every week on top of the free World War Now show, and every month we try to do one of these Q&As. So we're about to dive into some really good questions from our supporters, and let's just dive right into it. We're going to start here with a question from Scott, who asks, what is it about Iran's nuclear facilities that makes a strike on them particularly provocative to Russia and China? Is Iran such an important ally that a compromised power grid in Iran would significantly compromise Russia or China's strategic military posture? Is it that a Western allied Iran would mean NATO in the Caspian? This is a really good question. This is a super World War Now related question. If anything, you could say this is the central geopolitical issue that we kind of orbit around on World War Now. So it's good to dive into this. Dmitry, what are your thoughts on this question, and how are you doing?
Not bad, Conrad. And yes, it's a key question because it deals with, of course, Cold War era nuclear proliferation, and just the fact that the West allowed certain nations such as Israel to obtain nuclear weapons. And by the West, I mean certain people within the American deep state during the presidency of JFK, as you may know. It's essentially pretty much worthy of its own episode, exactly how Israel obtained nuclear weapons. But in order for the Middle East to have a balance of power, Iran also needs to be armed with weapons of a similar level of strength and power, essentially. Of course, we're speaking about weapons that cause a vast amount of destruction, but Iran is not just one of the most stable countries of recent years. I mean, since the 1970s, it's had relative stability, and even its birth rate and demographics have actually been improving over the last few years, which show a sort of cultural cohesion and homogeneity, regardless of the transition from the Shah to the current revolutionary Republican style of rule that now sort of characterizes Iran. I think the interests of China and Russia lie in the fact that they wish to have a counterbalance in the Middle East, a nation which will balance the interests of, I guess, the global South against the global North, which is these Western nations such as the US, the nations comprising the European Union, and of course the British Empire, which is now the UK, and still, I suppose, the British Empire, in that its global financial interest is still incredibly powerful and influential. And Iran was always seen as that sort of linchpin. The Russian Empire has always influenced and tried to have influence over Iran in order to use it as a nation against the British Empire during the Great Game of the 1800s. And that Great Game, I suppose, in some way continues today. Unfortunately, notice even when Khomeini came to power after the Iranian Revolution in the 1970s, he was very, very opposed to communism and Marxism. Now that Russia has lost that destructive ideology, which the religious Shia Iranians were very opposed to, suddenly Iran is a very close potential ally to Russia once again, just as it was during the early Shahs when the Russian Empire was still around. So it really brings around that potential coalition in the future of countries which are opposed to Western values, to Enlightenment values, having an ally in the Middle East, an ally who will probably stand the test of time, because as we know, Iran, the Persian people, and all these other small minorities living in those mountains and valleys of the Middle East, they go back literally to the Old Testament and biblical times. So I think it's geopolitical interests that kind of characterize Russia and China's relation to the Iranian nuclear industry, as well as just long-term visions of what they want the Middle East to be representative of. And essentially it's notice Russia, China, Iran, these are all ancient, old civilizations which are 1,000 years and older. In this case, Russia would be the youngest out of the three. So I think it's a very interesting tripartite coalition that they've built. But going forward, nuclear, as we know, nuclear deterrence, Conrad, is essentially the key to real sovereignty, as we find out, especially notice even smaller and weaker countries like Pakistan, yet they utilize nuclear weapons as their sort of key to remaining independent from the greater and stronger India, as well as some of its other neighbors.
I think the fact that Israel has finally started vocalizing its, the fact that it can and is thinking about striking the nuclear capabilities, and then we immediately saw Russia pivot more towards Iran and Palestine and start putting the pressure on Israel. And the fact that we saw that proves that this is, much like the prophecies have talked about, that this is that linchpin issue in the Middle East that would bring, in many ways, this is the issue that would bring the multipolar world more into a sort of this alignment that a lot of the alt media people seem to think it is, that it's this anti-Western based military alliance to overthrow, the Washington, D.C., London, Brussels, New World Order, when, as we heard from India, as you were just talking about India, member of BRICS, has no interest in being part of something like that. So that's clearly not exactly what's happening. But if Israel, of course, with the implicit backing of the United States, takes this step, it could make that alliance more potent in that direction. But I think the fact that the U.S. did basically tell Iran that if Iran strikes Israel with greater intensity than they did on October 1st, like they are claiming they will, the U.S. basically gave Israel the green light to strike their nuclear capabilities. So I fear that, again, this episode is being recorded on the day of the election, so I don't know the results. By the time you're listening to this, we will. So maybe some of these answers will be changing. I don't think so. I think we're mostly talking about perennial issues here, but this is something that I think we could easily see before the end of the year. We could definitely see it upon Trump's inauguration in January, if that's how things go this evening. So it's a very interesting question. And again, thank you, Scott, for asking something so interesting. We're going to ask your next question. I want to shout you out for asking some good stuff, so even the free people will get to listen to this great content. So thank you, Scott. He asks, the life of St. Gabriel of Georgia mentions an encounter with Grand Duchess Leonida Georgievna Romanova Bagrationi. She asks if she will live to see the years of the restored monarchy in Russia. St. Gabriel answers that she will not, but her grandson will. Her grandson, Grand Duke George Mikhailovich, is now 43. I find it interesting that St. Gabriel did not mention his mother, Leonida's daughter, would live to see the monarchy. She is 76. Could her death be a milestone indicating the monarchy's return is imminent? Your thoughts on this question, Dimitri?
I think potentially, but we just need to keep in mind the fact that this prophecy was foretold to that particular branch, to Leonida Georgievna, despite the fact that she may not have even been married to her future husband, the Grand Duke Vladimir Kirillovich, who was part of the, I suppose, one of the most powerful branches of the remaining Romanov family in exile. This particular branch of the family, essentially her future father-in-law was endorsed, Kirill was endorsed by St. John of Shanghai, essentially, as the leader of sort of the Russian white emigres, and endorsed by almost the entire Church of Rokor as a potential future emperor of Russia if the monarchy was ever restored. Now, that particular lineage and those rights to the throne were unfortunately lost by his son, actually, the husband of Leonida Bagrationi. This is the Georgian princess who, again, married the Grand Duke of Russia, Vladimir. But I think what's key here is that, unfortunately, Leonida Bagrationi, this lady who had the conversation of St. Gabriel, she had a very, very bad reputation amongst the aristocracy, nobility, and even the Orthodox Christians abroad. So it's quite an interesting conversation because her first marriage in the 1930s was to essentially a Jewish businessman named Somner Kirby. They were married for a few years and they became divorced. And 11 years after this marriage, she then married the Grand Duke of Russia. And as you can understand, marrying a divorcee, we see that in the British royal family today, not a very popular move, especially one that has been married to a Jewish man in her former life. And also the Bagrationi house, despite it being a really big noble family in Georgia, and at one point they were actual royalty that ruled over Georgia during the late Middle Ages, it did not hold the same status amongst the Russian aristocracy as some of the other Russian noble houses. So it was never considered that the Bagrationi could become potentially future kings of Georgia. They lost that status a long time ago. And when Georgia essentially split into multiple states after the Middle Ages and after the Renaissance period. So unfortunately, Leonida is a very interesting character, but her reputation was incredibly bad. And some of the rumors spread around her during the 20th century were pretty negative as well, including, they've claimed that she was cheating on her husband, the Grand Duke Vladimir. The fact that they only had one child, the Grand Duchess Maria, who's, as you mentioned, Conrad, is still alive at 76. And yes, potentially, I would say that based on what we see today geopolitically, I think if this prophecy is true and correct, St. Gabriel was clairvoyantly giving us a real sort of picture of what might take place, given that the Russian Prince George is still around, still in very good health, and he's very active in Russia. In fact, I was following his Twitter X account early on during the Russian SMO, and he was actually posting pro-Russian materials when the SMO first began, which was quite interesting. And of course, his Twitter X account was later, I believe, deleted. Perhaps people in his family or his family lawyers told him to remove it because they wouldn't want to, say, tarnish his reputation if the SMO went the wrong way, perhaps. But in any case, this particular branch of the family, it will play a key role in the future restoration of the monarchy, even if the future Tsar of Russia doesn't come from this particular branch of the Romanov family. Still, I think they'll have a future in how Russia will play out in its sort of civilizational role as a future Tsardom, only because they've remained loyal to the Orthodox Church. Yes, they made some interesting decisions, such as Kirill Vladimirovich, he did visit the Third Reich on a couple of occasions during the 1930s, but then again, who really didn't visit the Third Reich back then? There were interesting positions on Bolshevik Russia, but they remained faithful Orthodox Christians regardless. And all these family issues, they don't really relate to your particular question, which is, could the prophecy take place? Based on what you've written and based on what's taking place now, definitely. And Maria Vladimirovna, mind you, she's already kind of reclused herself and isolated herself away from any inheritance. She's claimed that she doesn't wish to be a claimant to the Russian throne any longer. And so now at 76, she's well and truly retired from any sort of politics. And if she does pass over the next 5 to 10 years, we may enter into that phase, this new phase of Russian reintegration into its civilizational path, which is the path of the Russian Orthodox Tsardom, and the monarchy will most definitely be restored. We know this also aligns with all the other prophecies, Conrad, we spoke about earlier, from all the Russian saints and even saints outside of Russia. Some of the Affinite elders, they all speak about the Orthodox world having a new revival. And of course, this comes in the form of Orthodox monarchy in the political realm, because there is no other real political system that the Orthodox Church endorses. So I completely agree. I mean, this prophecy sounds true. It completely aligns with everything else that's been said on the show countless times. And I think more or less it has complete validity, yeah.
I think the fact that currently in Georgia there is wider popular support for the idea of a monarchy shows that it could precede the return of the Russian Tsardom, but it wouldn't be as likely. It, if anything, is more likely that somehow the monarchy is installed as a way of, showing goodwill between Russians and Georgians when the Russians somehow get Georgia more within its sphere of influence in some kind of even imperial sense. Because, the emperor can be above kings. There can be kings and then there can be the kings that become part of a broader empire, and there are treaties signed and subsidiarity is worked out and whatnot. So I think, St. Gabriel, we talked about his prophecies on the latest World War Now episode and how they lined up with prophecies of St. Philomenos of Jacob's Well. So very interesting saint. And he has had a lot of things to say about what would happen in the midst of World War III, as well as, how Georgia would also be protected by the Theotokos. So I think the fact that Russian troops will make it through Georgia to fight the Turks, I think that will likely mean that before that occurs, Georgia will have been brought into the Russian sphere of influence. But the next question we have here is a big one. This is from Benjamin. He asks, my question is this: I think Putin is a good leader, and I want to believe that he has the protection of his people and his faith at heart. I appreciate that he has many difficult decisions to make, and he can't please all the people all the time. It does seem to me that he is controlled by his handlers from the WEF. I mean, after all, he has turned a blind eye to some things that anyone putting their country first would not tolerate. I can understand that something on the scale of Nord Stream pipeline does not warrant a knee-jerk reaction and needs proper planning for a response. Having the US, UK, France, Germany, etc. fund Zelensky killing Russian troops does not seem to warrant bringing them into the war. Now European countries are providing money and weapons. He goes on to say that he basically sees that Putin hasn't fully mobilized for the war, and he's wondering if he's missing anything. He says, maybe Putin is a better man than me, or he sees something I don't, or maybe he's in league with the enemy. My question is this: how can you witness the destruction of the canonical Orthodox Church, see the priests and parishioners beaten, expelled, and in some cases murdered, see the relics desecrated and satanic parties held in the Skov Caves Lavra, and not do anything about it? Why has he not defended his faith and his church? Your thoughts, Dimitri, and then I'll follow up.
Benjamin, great question. I think this is one of the biggest mysteries of our time, right? And there are a few points on which we can directly, if we had a chance to ask Vladimir Putin these questions, unlike Tucker Carlson, who essentially asked more or less irrelevant things to the president, there would be some key questions such as, well, why hasn't the murder of Prigozhin and Colonel Dmitry Utkin been investigated, and the other passengers of the flight, what exactly happened to them? The other question would be, well, how has Putin's political position changed? What forced his sort of transition from this sort of new liberal leader that he was in the early 2000s, speaking about integration of NATO, the UN, Russia's position in the UN, Russia's position in spreading democracy, liberalism, values which are essentially not conservative at all. There'd be questions as to how he made that internal transition, what exactly prompted, which books has he read. We know that he's read Ivan Ilyin since the early 2000s, so he's read Russian Orthodox nationalist literature. But it would be interesting to actually get inside of his mind and to understand how he has matured and how he's changed his position, because that would maybe alleviate some of these fears that we may have that, well, he's just essentially a controlled op, right? Which is essentially one of the queries you have here. And again, there's lots of questions about 2014. What happened to all the Donbass leaders? Who assassinated them? What happened to Kirill Strimousov when the Russians left Kherson? Essentially, when we started this show in late 2022, what happened to all these patriotic Russian nationalist leaders? Why is Igor Strelkov the most monarchist, outspoken Russian Orthodox Christian who has sort of any political weight in Russia? Why is he currently in prison suffering with a debilitating heart condition? I'm not even going to get into that, but there'd be some real questions, and you cannot brush these off and claim, oh, well, the United Russia has nothing to do with this, the presidency, it's unrelated. It definitely is. It's 100% aligned to what the executive branch of power does in the Russian Federation. And other questions would include what happened to the Russian generals who are being investigated. Why is Shoigu, why hasn't he been prosecuted, given the fact that everyone around him has been charged with corruption? And why was the SMO put off for an entire 8-year period? Why was nothing done? What was Minsk 1 and 2 really all about? Essentially, if NATO was such a real threat. These are all very key geopolitical interests that Russia has had throughout its entire history, even prior to 2014, when Putin was literally visiting Kiev and shaking hands with the Ukrainian presidency. If we had answers to these questions, perhaps we could be more trustworthy of the president of the Russian Federation. But I will say the following, Conrad, and this is as a disclaimer. During President Putin's presidency, we do have a very strong and vast increase of right-wing Orthodox Christians actually rose. Even the fact that 2014 even happened during his presidency and that it wasn't suppressed from the beginning allows us to believe that whatever environment Putin created personally or that his party created, it has led to the flourishing of essentially a new wave and new generations of based Russian Orthodox Christians who will eventually lead to that same, well, in my opinion, that same restored monarchy, which Saint Gabriel, of course, spoke about, and all the other saints. So if Putin himself does not even understand this, he at least is being used as God's providential tool in order to bring about the future Orthodox Christian Russia. And just the fact that Russian Orthodox churches are being built, Patriarch Kirill's position is not being essentially stifled at all. Patriarch Kirill and the Russian Orthodox Church is acting very, very liberally and freely across Russia, improving orthodoxy, increasing it, multiplying it. There's been gigantic growth, right? Over 200 new dioceses and new bishops have been appointed since 2009. This is all during Vladimir Putin's presidency. So we just have to keep that into consideration. And of course, we always criticize the fact that Russia has not really rhetorically or politically or even militarily acted upon the persecution in Ukraine, which is why we cover it in such detail so that everyone understands, despite the fact that Russian media may not cover it, Western media most definitely will not cover some of these details of the persecution. At least we'll have a clear record of inaction in case this does go to some sort of trial of the people, or at least the trial of the conscience of the Orthodox people, when we can actually judge or even make a sort of discernment in our minds. Well, how orthodox is this particular political regime? Well, we can kind of judge by its actions, right? And viewing this persecution and seeing it, Conrad, I think that it really hasn't been addressed, I think is another misstep by the Putin presidency, but hopefully it will be alleviated very soon. And, we always pray for better results and for the enlightenment of our leaders, right, in church, during the liturgy, and in our private prayers. So we remain optimistic despite all the negatives that I mentioned earlier.
I think the question of why Putin isn't going full-on total war is that at a basic level, he still fears Western soft power trying to overthrow him, and he sees a total mobilization as something that would facilitate that too strongly. He views that he doesn't want protests. He doesn't want to have to crack down on protests in the street that could arise from a full-on mobilization. He doesn't want to have to redeploy troops to civilian areas in ethnic minority regions that might begin to protest against being mobilized to the war in Ukraine. The situation with the Chechens, the reason that he does a lot of the things that we don't like is because of he's one of the few leaders that has the power that he has and is still engaged in a very complex game of state building. I mean, look, yes, China has to deal with Taiwan and the Uyghurs, but compared to what Russia has to deal with, all of it, I mean, with the Ukraine issue, obviously, and then with Belarus and its borders, and then all of the Muslim regions and all the things going on there, it's very much having to work hard and employ old world methods in many ways to keep its empire intact. And I don't mean empire derogatorily. I just mean Russia is still, due to its size and scope and diversity and imperial power. And Putin is aware of that, and he's not confident in, I think, his ability right now to win a direct confrontation with the West and NATO. And I don't think he's confident in his ability to properly suppress a domestic situation that could be provoked by the West with the proper force that it would need to be put down without then losing the mandate and losing legitimacy in the eyes of his people. And he knows that he's getting old and his regime needs to be viewed as very strong as it prepares to choose its successors. So that is sort of the basic political perspective. And then, of course, we know that at a more basic level, there is a very large Jewish population and lobby in Russia. And they aren't just Jewish. The highest ranking and most powerful Jewish groups are Chabad Lubavitchers, who I would say in many ways are the most powerful Jews in the entire world, at least on the more religious side of the Jewish spectrum. And considering that they have it in with Jared Kushner and the people that have always been diverting Trump away from anything close to America first, you can view Putin in a very similar way, how his instincts, his personal beliefs, the monks and people that he talks to personally and finds most interesting are probably mostly correct. Maybe a little bit boomer and Soviet tier, but generally speaking in the right direction, Orthodox and these sorts of things. But the power of Jewish money and the power of the Lubavitchers and these others kind of keep him to understand, he plays the realistic game and he ends up, as usual, they always end up getting more of the pie than they think. And the Russian people and the American people in both examples, respectively, always end up holding the short end of the stick. But in many ways, we see the fact that Strelkov is in jail. Meanwhile, other Jewish oligarchs have either fled Russia or are still free. That's a perfect example of kind of what we're talking about here. And I think, even the fact that Jackson Hinkle is able to broadcast from Russia while Strelkov is in jail, I think that's a perfect example of the kind of triumph of the boomer transcending Russian and American politics and being just a perennial issue that the world is facing right now. And what we're seeing, of course, though, is the younger population, the more Orthodox populations. We talked to Andrei Afanasyev. He represents a large and growing population of people in Russia, and that is becoming more relevant. And I think, much like when we were answering Scott's questions about the monarchy and these other things, there is a non-zero chance that Putin's successor is some form of monarch, and there is a new sort of state inducted into the world and into the Russian people have. Maybe it's a constitutional monarchy or something akin to, not quite what existed before the revolution, but that is very much a possibility. And I think Putin is aware of the delicacy of that situation and doesn't want to knock things over too much. But that being said, at a certain level, you are correct that if he plays things too carefully, he might grow too docile. And next thing you know, he's kind of waltzed into a situation where his people are unhappy from the other direction. I think he needs to take more territory than just the 4 oblasts in their entirety for the people at home to be satisfied with the sacrifices that they made for this special military operation, as they're still kind of ridiculously calling it. So that's my perspective on all of that. Dmitry, what's the next question?
Question by Alexander Suvorov, of course, the Generalissimo and the great Russian field marshal. So the question here is, I spoke with an elderly Greek priest once, and he told me that back in the day, there was a persecution of the Orthodox Church by the Ku Klux Klan. Can you break this persecution down and maybe see if it applies to what is going on now and the future? And of course, Kyle Romanos also adds to this. He says, it would not surprise me as the Ku Klux Klan was a WASP Protestant organization that hated Roman Catholics. Very interesting. I'm not the most learned person on the Ku Klux Klan, but given the history of the southern states of America and their sort of distrust of Roman Catholicism, because most Roman Catholics actually migrated to the northern states. And of course, I believe just the culture of those southern states sort of facilitated the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. There were several waves, essentially. Ku Klux Klan, even in and of itself, Conrad, I believe it changed, essentially. There were several phases. Their views even changed over the period of American history, the 19th century. There were probably even reasons for why the Ku Klux Klan, legitimate reasons for why they even became prominent, at least in the initial phases. And of course, later on, that changed to sort of address criminality in the southern states, especially after the American Civil War. how I shouldn't really be close to that. And, most people view the Ku Klux Klan essentially as this Black Hundreds type pogrom against African Americans organization, despite, their sort of views of traditional church structures outside of that sort of Protestant vision of Christianity. I'm not too familiar with it. Unfortunately, the only literature which I've found on the subject are all published by Fordham University Press, which, as we know, is a very liberal and leftist publication, despite the fact that many of its publishers are members of the Greek Orthodox Church, the Greek Archdiocese, GOARCH, in the United States. I would be very suspicious of even reading their material. I'd think you would need to do so with taking their information with a grain of salt. Anyone really researching this subject of Orthodox Christianity and the Ku Klux Klan and how Orthodoxy spread throughout the southern states in the 19th century. But it wouldn't surprise me that perhaps there was some light persecution of the early Greek Orthodox immigrants in the United States. Whether or not it took up some large pattern, we know the Ku Klux Klan essentially, there's not that many deaths sort of attributed to that particular organization in general. And so the persecution would be essentially less than what we see in Ukraine today. It would be less severe, it'd be less serious, and if anything, it was essentially viewing the Orthodox Church as an alien organization to America, maybe viewing it with suspicion and just the general mistrust towards immigrants, which we saw, I think, in most nations, Conrad, most nations who at first saw Orthodoxy, not all of them reacted in a very positive fashion. We know that in India, there was persecution. Most countries, all of the early apostles, a lot of them were martyred by the people amongst whom they preached, right? Especially those who were opposed to Christianity. This is very general. Even in China itself, even there were martyrs in Alaska as well. So it shouldn't surprise us. We shouldn't really take the Ku Klux Klan or these conservative former or Protestant Americans and view them as enemies of the church. I think it should be viewed in the context of the 19th century. So that's just my view. And again, I'm very suspicious of Fordham publications on the subject because, as we know, these people like to exploit the issue of so-called racism in America and all other countries around the world because they are essentially globalists. They are pushing this very strange Talmudic mixing melting pot theory, which we know is essentially what Rebbe Schneerson spoke about. Again, all the questions seem to tie together very strongly. So Fordham University should be viewed with great skepticism, but at the same time, I don't discount what this elderly Greek priest actually said. Perhaps he has more information than we do. And, it's really good to listen to a variety of opinions, especially from Orthodox Christian clergy. Doesn't mean you have to take their words and sort of, this is just essentially what he told you was a historical anecdote. So I would just take it as it is and sort of go along with that. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, the Klan, they obviously didn't like immigrants, and Greek people are pretty foreign, especially before multiculturalism set in. A Greek person's fairly different from a WASP Protestant. And I really don't think much of the persecution had that much of a religious nature. Obviously, they viewed Catholics as well as, heretics and idolaters and these sorts of things. But it was very much an ethno-nationalist, a blending of ethno-religious nationalism, very much civilizational nationalism. And obviously, I don't support the Ku Klux Klan per se. I'm an Orthodox Christian. But let's be honest, Greeks don't love immigrants either. I've been to Greece and they have a very strong chauvinistic pride. So I do have a strong opinion about Greek remigration, not because I want Greeks to leave America. I love the Greeks in America, but I think that Greece needs its Greeks back, and they are being encroached upon by foreigners from other lands. And I think that's something so this idea that, Greeks need to be basking in their history of oppression as immigrants, I'll recount some things I know that are true. This is from 1922, Kansas City, February 21st, following a quarrel in Kansas City today between a Greek laborer and American, a general fight ensued in which 4 men were painfully hurt. 50 Greeks were being attacked by a crowd of 600 men and boys armed with sticks and stones when the police reserves arrived and arrested a number of the participants. So I've heard that there were boycotts on Greek businesses, that the Klan would organize these sorts of things. And again, none of this is good, but every country is at discontent when immigrants move in. The 1920s in particular were massive waves of immigrants were moving in from Italy, from Greece, from Ireland, from a lot of these places. And this was in many ways very disruptive. If people are aware of the fact that immigrants are kind of ruining our society today in America, you can have a bit more sympathy for, again, what some of these people took too far and, used to express a disdain for a fellow Christian people that probably wasn't warranted. It's something that, let's put it this way, I'm very wary of. This is good that this was asked because I've wanted to talk about this. Maybe I'll have an entire topic about this in the future, an Ether Hour, but I'm very wary of the attempt by American society and the elites within Greeks in America to kind of join themselves to this immigrant POC coalition, Greeks being proud that they're not white, being proud that they're not WASPs, emphasizing the anti-fundamentalist Protestant nature of Orthodoxy. You hear this from people that want to believe in evolution. They'll denounce Father Seraphim Rose and others and say, oh, we're not like those white Protestants. They want to emphasize this immigrant, foreign, frankly, liberal identity. This is why for many years Greeks had been aligned with the Democratic Party. Father Alex Karloutsos and Elpidoforos, they, until very recently, would never speak at the GOP events. It was only ever at the DNC. And it was, obviously, we had Elpidoforos marching with BLM. And before him, we had Archbishop Yakovos back in the day marching with communist Martin Luther King. So there's been this very long, later 20th century effort to graft the Greeks, who are the largest Orthodox Christian population within America, to graft them into the general liberal coalition, the Democratic coalition, the social democracy coalition, and that needs to be avoided at all costs. So as much as we can definitely denounce whatever specific actions certain people that would have been connected to the Klan may have taken against specific Greek people, this idea that Greeks need to be like, we were victims of this violence as well. No, Greeks should be strong, conservative traditionalists who want to restrict abortion and who should recognize that more immigrants from these, third world crummy countries aren't going to be good for them either. And I do also agree that if Greeks are so nationalist and love Greece so much, and I don't mean this in a vindictive or mean way, but they should perhaps look into moving back to Greece. And I know the economy isn't good, but let me tell you what doesn't help the economy is having all the smart and wealthy people move away to another country. So I think in many ways we need to make Greece great again. And I will do everything I can to make that real. And I also have thought of moving to Greece and Cyprus in the future myself. So I will do my part in that regard. So I think that's my take on that. But again, in no way do I support the Klan, obviously. And it was not good that they probably should have focused more energy on other groups and not other Christian immigrants.
No, definitely. Absolutely. Next question. These questions only escalate in how interesting they are.
Thank you so much for listening to the free preview of this Ether Hour Q&A. If you want to join the supporters and ask us questions on these monthly Q&A threads, be sure to click the link down below, get behind the paywall, support us on a monthly or yearly basis, and ask us whatever questions you want. You will also get access to our whole Ether Hour backlog and, of course, every weekly future Ether Hour episode, Q&A or not. So be sure to get behind that paywall. We answer all sorts of great questions about our favorite bishops currently active in the church. We talk about Stefan Bandera. We talk about Orthodox anarchism, our perspective on America, of course, as Orthodox Christians, Yugoslav wars, what Z means in the SMO, a whole host of other questions. So thank you so much for listening, and we will see you on the other side. God bless.